He's also taken the course as an audit, and it's been a real blessing. And he presided tonight, and although I had an appointment during the mass time, but all the students who were there said, at least I talked to, said it was an amazing reflection. So thank you. So he's been a real gift all the way around. And then we only have him in St. Louis for this semester, and he's here every Wednesday doing that. So I can't thank you guys enough for coming. I think the topic is really, really important. If you've ever read American Magazine, so Matt was editor of American Magazine for 10 years, and the last 10 years of American Magazine has been explosive in terms of the topics they've dealt with, everything they've handled along the way. You're probably familiar with the fact that he had a powerful interview with the Pope Francis, and did a remarkable job with that as well. So his writing is amazing, his editing is amazing, his motivation, his leadership, but the topic, as you know, it's just huge. It's just huge for our church right now. So, and I just don't even know what to do with the information I got going ready because of it. So let me just end by saying, Matt, we are so grateful that you've given us this time. And all he's getting for doing this,
It's a box
of Girl Scout cookies that he took right out of my pocket.
I told him to display it.
I know. But you guys, welcome. By the way, if you need anything to
We were trying to incentivize people to sit in the front row.
There you go.
well, they're here. Look at this. This is a great turnout too, you guys. I'm so excited. Thanks for being learners. One of the things I love about the CSC is people here are curious. They want to know more. And you demonstrate that tonight. So join me in welcoming Matt.
Thank you. Thank you, and thank you, Father Gary, for your generous hospitality and your even more generous introduction. It's really great for me to be here with you tonight. Can everybody hear me? Yeah. Great, good. So tonight, I thought I would share with you some of reflections that I have about the topic of American politics and Catholicism. I think we titled this talk Catholic Approaches to U.S. Politics, because we didn't really know what I was going to talk about. And I thought long and hard about it, and decided that I really wanted to talk about something that I wasn't necessarily going to talk about directly in the course I'm teaching next door, but I think is actually is profoundly important, and it's something that affects all of us. So what I'd like to talk about tonight is how polarization is playing out in the country, of how that is playing out in our church, and what I think is first of all what causes that, and then secondly what we need to do about it, both within the church and within society. And then we'll have a conversation. We can chat about whatever you like. Okay. So there are, in a certain sense, in the life of the United States, polarization is not a new thing. It has been a part of American history from our founding. In fact, you can't get more polarized than a civil war, right? The difference in our polarization today is that it structures the social and political and even personal life of the country in a way that it did not before. So sometimes people will often say, well, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams said some pretty terrible things about each other, which they did, right? The country was deeply polarized in that election of 1800. But the thing is, people fought an election and then they went home. And they went home to their farms and they went home to their cities, and they didn't think about it for 2 years because they had lives, right? And now politics has become a kind of national pastime. We obsessed with it. It touches on every part of our national life, and it's impossible for us to get away from it. And there are some reasons why. There are identifiable causes of polarization. Now, one of them, I think, that is often overlooked in conversations about this is is really more of a theological reason why there is polarization in this country. You will probably have noticed, especially as people of faith, that we live in a country that is rapidly secularizing, right? Attendance and participation in religious faith is declining across the board, right? In almost every part of religious life, you're seeing this decline. One of the difficulties with an increasingly secularized world is that in such a world, we're cut off from the transcendent. We are cut off from, we're cut off from God, but we're cut off from some sense of there being a purpose that is beyond our own. That there is, we're cut off from a sense that there might be something greater to our lives that is more than just our own flourishing as human beings, right? And this kind of secularization that I'm talking about is unique in Western history. It's really unprecedented, because for the first time in thousands of years, collectively as a society, we have abandoned any sense that there is a purpose and a reason for human living that is beyond this time and space we call Earth, right? That's unprecedented in the history of the West. If you want to read a great book about this, though it's a very long one, it's Charles Taylor's A Secular Age. Well, the thing is, I mean, we kind of all know that, right? Because we're living it. But what happens as God becomes less important, then our politics, strangely enough, will become more important, right? Because if there is nothing beyond this life, nothing beyond the here and now, there are no goals beyond our flourishing right here in this time and space, then what concerns only this time and space becomes all the more important, right? In other words, politics is just a way of distributing the goods of the world, right? That's why we constitute governments. That's why we have politics as a means of debating how to distribute the finite goods of the world, right? But if the finite goods of the world are all that there is, then they become even more and more and more valuable. And our politics then really becomes our religion, because the stakes get higher and higher and higher. And politicians take on this kind of quasi-priestly role as mediators, right? And it's a very difficult thing to break out of, precisely because we're not even aware that it's happening, right? So, I mean, if those goods are, if the finite goods of the world are all that we have, and therefore, since they're finite and limited, they become more and more valuable, then our fights about them become more and more dramatic, and our politics becomes more and more moralistic, right? Because the stakes are now a lot higher than they were before. So when we talk about what are the causes of polarization, that's one, secularism, right? Now, you know, we're not probably going to reverse secularism in any meaningful way in the next 45 minutes. But nonetheless, I think it's an important thing to bear in mind, especially for people of faith who are thinking about how to address this problem of polarization. Because secularism raises the stakes for our politics, right? So what are the causes of polarization? That's one, the secular age in which we're living. Secondly, and these aren't necessarily in the order of importance, but they're in the order that they occurred to me. The second is the fact that we're using social media as a primary news source and as a means of interacting, primarily. Social media, as you know, is constructed around AI, around artificial intelligence, right? And we programmed the AI, and we said, what we want you to do is maximize engagement, right? And then the AI discovered something about us that we Catholics already knew. There's such a thing called original sin. And so what maximizes, what turns out what maximizes our engagement is anger, right? Rage. That's what maximizes our engagement. In other words, we have met the enemy and it is us, right? And that's important to recognize because that's not only just a bad way to structure our conversation and debate as a country, but it's actually messing with our brains, right? Because that kind of engagement is directly related to our dopamine levels. And I don't think that kind of, and I don't think it's an accident that what we're seeing among American youth are with these unprecedented rates of anxiety and depression and loneliness and all the rest. I don't think that's unrelated to the prevalence of social media, which isn't necessarily bad in itself. I just spent 10 years running a company that relies on social media, right? But it's an important thing to be aware of, especially if we use it as a primary news source. So that's two. What are the causes of polarization? Two, using social media as a primary news source and the way that it's engineered to anger us, right? Thirdly, I think, is the fact that in the United States, journalism, in addition to its noble aspirations, is also a commercial enterprise. And you may not watch cable news, but most of America does. And most of America still gets its news from cable news, right? Now, back when there were 3 networks, ABC, CBS, and NBC, the way that you attracted a mass market for advertisers was by creating the absolute biggest demographic possible, right? So news had to be a place where America came together because that was the business model, right? And that's why people who were of vastly different political temperaments all watched the same news, right? But that's directly related then to the editorial policies that those networks adopted, right? So if they're if the goal here is to build as big a mass market as possible to sell it to advertisers, you can't be turning people away. You got to be a place where everybody comes, right? But with the proliferation of cable news channels, all of that changed, right? It then became about slicing and dicing the demographic of your viewers, right? And saying to whichever advertiser you're pitching, we own this part of the demographic. And then that required a shift in the editorial policy, right? They had to take a different approach. They now had to appeal to this much smaller part of the demographic. And this is true of cable news across the board, right? So that is deeply problematic because John Courtney Murray, who was a Jesuit in the middle of the 20th century, he once said, argument is actually a difficult thing to have. Because in order to have a real argument, you have to have shared presuppositions and you have to have shared data. And we don't have a means of sharing data, right? We're not even using the same facts, right? So what are the causes of polarization? Secularism, social media, journalism as a commercial enterprise. I think that's a pretty good start. But the thing is, at the end of the day, you didn't really need me to tell you any of that. And any number of people across the street could have told you that, right? And that's because it's kind of an easy question to answer. What are the causes of polarization? But see, I have recently begun to be troubled by the notion that it's the wrong question. right? And asking the right question is really important because you can have the right answer, but if it's to the wrong question, then it doesn't really help at the end of the day, right? And in my mind, I think there's a better question. It isn't so much what are the causes of polarization as who. Who is the cause of polarization? And the answer to that is obvious, I think, or at least it should be. You are, and I am, right? We are the causes of polarization. Polarization is not something that is happening to us. It's something that we're causing, all of us, by virtue of our choices, by choices that we make every day. I mean, consider this for a moment. In 2016, you had one of the closest presidential elections in American history. If 100,000 people in the Rust Belt had voted differently, Hillary Clinton would have been president. It was that close, right? But then consider this. 65% of Americans live in a congressional district that voted for either Trump or Clinton by 20 points or more. What that tells us is we don't even live near people we disagree with. We don't live near people who have different views than we do, right? That's not something that's happening to us. Those are choices we're making, right? At the end of the day. And, you know, this might be unwelcome news that we are the causes of polarization. But actually, I think it's hopeful news because as long as this whole business of polarization is something that's happening to us and somebody else is the cause of, then there's nothing that we can really do about it. There's nothing that you can do about it or I can do about it, right? Because, you know, at the end of the day, if I'm not causing it and I'm simply affected by it negatively, then what's there for me to do to fix it? Right? But if we can acknowledge, which is sort of something we're supposed to be doing in Lent, right? If we can acknowledge what we have done and failed to do, right, in this regard, then we can begin to change our own behavior, right? Now, is that going to translate into a mass movement? It would be nice if it did, but the point is that we're not powerless in the face of this. There are things that we can do. There are better choices that we can make. And I think it's particularly important for us as Catholics to carefully consider this, because this polarization that is racking our country and destroying our social fabric is also inside of the church, right? And I think we've all seen that too, right? Very often the same kinds of invective, the same kinds of partisan divisions, the same kinds of cliques, these fault lines are found within the church, right? Now, polarization is a very dangerous thing for our society, but it's really bad in the church. It's really bad. And the reason for that is that our unity resides in the body of the risen Lord, not in some shared sense of ideas. In other words, the United States of America exists because different agents called states, geographic groups, came together, right, and said, now we're going to gather around this set of ideas during the Declaration of Independence or whatever, or in the Constitution, and we're going to form a country, a federated union, right? And therefore, the national motto is out of many, one, right? But for the church, it's the opposite. Because of the one, we are many, right? Our unity does not come from some shared allegiance to some set of ideas or to some political program, but from the death and resurrection of the Lord. So for us to allow the divisions within the country to infiltrate the church does great damage to the church. It truly does. right? And now you might think that by talking this way, by sort of spiritualizing the divisions within the church, I might be papering over them. I'm not. They're real. People have serious disagreements about where we should go and what the Pope is saying and doing and all the rest. These are real issues. But at the end of the day, what I'm suggesting is that we need to lower the stakes. And we can do that as a church by recognizing who it is that we're serving. You know, we believe in a God, the God of Jesus Christ, the one who is the way and the truth and the life. And as Pope Benedict said, if Jesus is the truth, then we can never possess the truth. We dare to hope that he possesses us. That's what we pray for, right? And that's really important, because that means if truth is a someone, if it's ultimately a someone, then that prevents it from becoming a something that we beat each other over the head with, right? And that's crucial, I think. Because if Catholics are going to make a contribution to overcoming polarization, we need to overcome it first ourselves, right? And if our unity is already made real by the life and death and resurrection of the Lord, larger world, to hold up a model and say there is a different way. There is a different way. And I dare say that, you know, we have all of these very important debates every presidential election about whether Catholics should vote this way or that way, or whether they can vote this way or that way. I actually think that this witness is much more important. What we could contribute here to showing a different kind of engagement in the public square, a different kind of discourse, that is even more vitally important than how we vote, right? At the end of the day, polarization does not require a unanimity, right? I mean, as I was saying, within the church, right, by recognizing that our unity resides in the indivisible body of the Lord, that isn't papering over our differences, it's making them possible. It's making a constructive conversation and engagement around those differences possible, because it means that your different view, your different opinion, your different way of doing something is not a mortal threat to me, right? It becomes a kind of thorn in my side rather than a dagger in my heart, right? When we recognize that we're already united, right? By virtue of the Lord's sacrifice. And I think that that's tremendously important, because what really ails us at the heart of this problem of polarization in the U.S. is not, as I said, some diversity of opinion or divergent worldviews or competing ideologies, because we've always had those things. Right? Polarization doesn't require those things. Democracy requires those things. Right? We have democracy because we have differences of opinion, different and competing ideologies and philosophies and so forth. What polarization requires is two poles, each of which believes that the other is culturally, socially, politically, and even morally irredeemable. Right? That's what polarization is. Right? And what's interesting about that, to me, is in order to do that, one pole has to completely depersonalize the other side. Right? In other words, truth is no longer a person. and then we are no longer made in the image of that person and therefore have some reflection of this truth in all of us, right? But truth becomes a something that we beat each other over the head with, right? That we go to combat over, right? And then that then, as the stakes get higher and higher and higher because we're in a secular world, then that is what leads us to depersonalize the other side. So you might be tempted to think that the problem with our politics is that it's gotten too personal. But it's actually the opposite problem. It's not personal enough, right? People are not engaging with people, they're engaging with ideas of people. You know, and you can see this sometimes because I recently adopted this strategy. So it's been a kind of a little experiment for me. So as I travel around, inevitably I'll meet people who will say something nasty about one side or the other, right? Those liberals are so stupid. Those conservatives are so hateful, right? And they're not even aware of what they're saying. But you know what stops them in their tracks? Is when I say, you know, you're talking about people that I love. It stops them in their tracks, right? Because that's the truth. I mean, I have people in my family, I have people in my life who have different views on these things, right? I mean, you are talking about people that I love, right? And the nice thing about that, you know, how people respond when they hear that is they immediately intuit, oh, something's off here, right? Something's off. Because the opposite of love isn't really, I mean, yes, it's hate, but there are very few people who hate intensely in the way that you would have to hate to be the opposite of love. The real opposite of love is contempt, right? And so in this polarized, I mean, Thomas Aquinas said that the very definition of love is to will the good of the other, right? But in a situation of polarization, you have such contempt for the other side that you will their destruction, right? It's that, right? So how is it that we might be able to turn this around? Well, I mean, here's something, I really like inclusive language, like really inclusive language, like idolatry, right? It's a really inclusive word because we all have some idol, right? And at the end of the day, we have these old symbols that from our faith that I think speak to this moment and give us some indication of where we ought to go, right? So, for example, Pope Francis when he was speaking to the United States Congress, he said, you know, we have to, and he basically gave a talk, an amazing talk to Congress, you'll recall when he came and visited here, and he said, we have to basically end this polarization. It's un-Christian. He also came very near to saying it's un-American, given your own history, right? But what he said was we have to avoid anything that would reduce the world into two camps, the sinners and the righteous. Because we're all sinners. We all can be righteous, right? And we really have to avoid this. He said because it plays into a fear. It plays into a fear that that because I give something to you, right? I mean, because I give something to you, that I have therefore lost a part of myself, right? Because the presupposition is it's a zero-sum game, right? So in other words, I can't give anything, because the object of the game is to hold on to everything, right? Now, we've seen this before because, you remember Adam and Eve, and they're in the garden, right? And then this serpent comes along and says, if you eat that fruit that God told you not to eat, then you will live forever, and you'll be like God, right? In other words, the serpent starts to play into this fear that Adam and Eve have, that what God has promised them, it won't be enough, right? In other words, that all there is this finite stuff, and yet I have inside of me this infinite desire for love. But all I see is this finite stuff, right? So the serpent comes along and plays right to that, right to their fear. Says, oh yeah, no, it's a zero-sum game. And and God doesn't want you to have what he has. And it's not going to be enough. So, take that. And then you'll live forever. You'll be like God. Then they eat it. Right? Because they panic. This is what human beings do. And then God comes walking through the garden. It's a lovely image, right? He comes walking through the garden, and he sees them, and he's like, something's wrong here. They say, what happened? And they say, well, we were afraid because we were naked. And God says to them, who told you that you were naked? Who told you that? You always sort of hear this, like it's Charlton Heston speaking. Who told you that you, right? But I think God's heart's breaking in that moment. He says, who told you this? Who lied to you? And then you believed it? Right. So they panicked. And then they have to leave Eden. It's a beautiful image of God. The last thing he does is he makes them clothes so they won't be cold. Then they go out. They have Cain and Abel, the original polarization. The rest is history. Right? But the thing is, what that tells us, I think, is that rooted in the very heart of this polarization, both within the church and in the world, is fear, right? It's this fear, the fear that drives us to panic, that causes us to sin, that causes us to try to seize back control by pushing out and pushing away and taking on. It's fear at the end of the day, right? Fear of what? Fear that this really is all there is, right? So another useful strategy, I think, is when we're engaged in trying to overcome polarization and we're encountering people who profoundly disagree with us about things. This is another little strategy I adopted in the last couple of years. I say to myself, in my head, I say, who told you that you were naked? Right? Because I bet that they're afraid of the same thing that I'm afraid of. Right? And see, the thing is, if you start there, then you start with what you have in common, which is that you're afraid. Right? And that's real. That's real. And because, I mean, there's ground, right? So this is why I think the most transformational political statement that Pope Francis has ever uttered is that first question. This is his answer to that first question he was asked in his first interview in America magazine when he started his pontificate. Who is Jorge Mario Bergoglio? He says, I am a sinner. I'm a sinner. That's a profoundly transformative political statement. Now, why? It doesn't seem that way. I mean, it may not seem that way, but it is, right? Because what it means is that, however, if he understands that as a defining characteristic, right, of his life, I mean, he's not just a sinner; he's also forgiven. That's implied, right? He's redeemed. But that's going to keep them humble. And if Catholics are to make a contribution to overcoming polarization, then we have to proceed in a penitential key. We have to proceed from our own sense of powerlessness, right? And from the living faith that it is in Christ that we are powerful, right? It is through Christ that we have strength. Because at the end of the day, the church is not just another, nonprofit organized for governmental action, and we are called as Christians to make a particular kind of contribution to the world. And so we simply don't want to go out into our secular culture and just become a part of the problem. Right? We want to bear witness to what is unique about our faith. And I think to mitigate against the constant temptation we have to panic, the constant temptation that we have to scapegoat others for our troubles, we have to proceed as penitents. Maybe this is why I'm giving this talk in Lent, right? We have to proceed as penitents from the acknowledgement of the sheer gratuity of our lives and the sheer gratuity of our redemption. This then becomes our strength and reorients us, gives us different eyes with which to see the same world, but in a way that we might be able to contribute something that's helpful, that's redemptive, that's healing, that's conciliatory. I just want to say one last thing about this. Actually, two last things about this. Yeah. I mean, at the end of, there was a time when I was desperately afraid to fly. I had this terrible, actually this will be the last thing that I say about this. And then we're happy to have a conversation. I was desperately afraid to fly, right? I had this phobia. It's an interesting thing, this flying phobia, because it comes on usually in your mid-20s. It doesn't matter how many times you've flown earlier. It happens more often to women, but it happens more severely in men. And it's a real phobia. Like I would wake up before I got on a plane. I was having nightmares that I was on the plane, and then I would get on the plane and I was throwing up and I was, shaking and my blood pressure was rising and I was panicking, right? And then I would get home and I had PTSD from the plane and I was, not able to sleep for 2 days. It was terrible. It was absolutely terrible. And I went to go see this guy, Dr. Albert Forgione. He was an Italian, chain-smoking Italian psychologist. And he was an expert in the psychology of air travel. And what he knew was that if your body was relaxed, you couldn't actually have a panic attack, right? If your body was relaxed, you couldn't actually have a panic attack. And so what he taught me how to do was how to keep my body relaxed before, during, and after a flight. And then eventually my brain rewired and didn't any longer recognize the plane as a threat, right? I was able to say, oh, the plane is not the enemy, the fear is the enemy, right? So what is that thing that keeps our body relaxed so we don't panic? I mean, it's our faith, but our living faith, right? It's that notion that Francis was getting at, that notion that I am weak, but I am strong because of the Lord, right? And that then allows him and can allow us to enter into the world from a place that could be helpful and conciliatory. Because I'll tell you, I had a lot of people, when they found out that I had this flying phobia, say a lot of things to me that were manifestly unhelpful. Right? I mean, one was, oh, yeah, well, I actually once had a close call going into Chicago, and I was like, I have no idea why. I mean, for some reason, when you tell people you're afraid of flying, they immediately tell you a story about how bad a flying experience they had. I really do not know why they do that. They're not intending to be mean, but it's just cruel. And then, so that wasn't helpful, right? And then another response would be, well, you know, a plane works off of these laws of aerodynamics, and it's actually quite statistically blah, 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 blah. And I was like, I know how a plane works. Like, I mean, I have like 5 master's degrees. I stopped counting at one point. The Jesuits make you get all of them. But I know how a plane flies. I'm not an idiot, right? Then the other one was you just need to, like, you know, drink a lot of Jack Daniels. Right? But that's just masking over the problem, right? But this guy, Albert Forgione, the chain-smoking Italian psychologist, he recognized I was afraid. I was afraid. And that there were things that I could do to not be afraid. And that was healing. I mean, I'm now Diamond Medallion on Delta. Made a huge difference in my life, right? Now, it might seem like a strange analogy, but so at the end of the day, when we go out, but I think it's related, because if you think of it this way, that when we start going out into the world or in the church and we start dealing with this problem of polarization, it's very important not to say the kinds of things people said to me, right? Just, it's not helpful. So what's the thing that you can do and say that's different, right? Like, you're talking about people that I love, right? Or maybe you listen differently. Instead of just listen, I mean, we all know what everybody, if somebody says, I'm X, you pretty much know what they think about things, right? So we don't necessarily, and then it becomes, you know, words that just trigger us, right? But what if we listened for what's behind the words? And not just the fear, which I'm sure is there, right? And which we share in some way. But what are the values? What if I made a deliberate attempt to listen for the values behind what they're saying, right? Because I'll bet that I have more in common with them that way, right? And then it's also a matter of making sure, I think, you know, Dr. Forgione was very clear that I could not avoid getting on a plane, it would only make it worse, right? And that at the end of this course, I was going to have to get on a plane, right? He said, because if you avoid it, it's just going to get worse, right? He said, and you know, there's a little thing there in psychology, I guess it's like exposure therapy. You sort of get gradually exposed to these things. And, well, we actually need to do that with polarization, right? Saying I'm not going to have anything to do with politics or civic life or anything like that, it's just going to make the problem worse. And not just for you, for everybody, right? But we can gradually sensitize ourselves by saying, you know, I can rearrange my social media feed. I can start reading opinions that I disagree with, right? I mean, it's amazing to me. People will complain about the state of Twitter, for example, somehow oblivious to the fact that they chose all of those people to follow, right? So unfollow, and follow some people that you might disagree with, but you think you could listen to, right? In other words, get on the plane, right? But do it in a different way. Sit in a different section, right? I mean, at the end of all of this, I think, is good news. If we're responsible for it, then we can change it. And we can change it by making different choices in our lives. And the only thing that we have to do is to do the very thing that Jesus tells us to do all the time. Be not afraid. Be not afraid. I'm with you always to the end of the age. You're not Abel. He's not Cain. Be not afraid. You are not naked. Okay? Thank you. Any thoughts? Yeah, please.
You said you were going to say two things, but you only said one.
Yeah, I changed my mind. I changed my mind because I did. I thought I am a sinner in the rest of that. Yeah. No, I changed my mind for a reason. The other one just didn't fit. Yeah. Yes, but thank you for listening so closely.
Thank you for this. I have a question about, like, part of the state of polarization today in the U.S. is sort of like the rampant proliferation of conspiracy theories.
Uh-huh.
And I'm sort of curious, because I think a lot of, like, some of the adherence to conspiracy theories is driving this like, state in which people no longer hold simply different opinions, but
Right.
are starting to live in completely different realities.
Uh-huh.
And not to say that dehumanization, fear, and some of the things, the factors that you're naming,
Right.
are contributing to that
Mhm.
situation. But I'm sort of curious, like, in this state where there's conspiracy theories and there's adherence to very different realities, like, what does overcoming polarization look like?
Right. Yeah, I mean, so here's what's interesting. There is one big conspiracy theory that a lot of people believe now is about how the election came about. But for the most part, a lot of people, it's a very small number of people who actually believe in conspiracy theories. But it's bigger than it used to be. And the reason for that is because people are able to find each other. Our founders, they were afraid of the United States becoming one of two things. They were terrified that it might become revolutionary Paris, and there would be a bloodbath, right? And it would get out of control. And the second thing that they were afraid of is that the United States would become Rhode Island, right? Terrified of that. Why? Because Rhode Island was too small, right? In the 18th century, Rhode Island was pretty much ungovernable. It was so small, and so these kind of extreme elements, they could find each other easily, and then they could form a large social group, or a faction, is what our founders called it, right? And it made Rhode Island ungovernable. So people like Madison and Jefferson, they felt the bigger the country, the better, okay? Because if we have a really big country, this is why a guy like Jefferson was actually okay doubling the size of the country. Because the bigger the country, the more we will actually have to govern based on a shared set of principles. And the harder it will be for those people to find each other and form factions that will subvert the Union. But the internet, so this worked for a couple of centuries, but the internet has now turned us into 18th century Rhode Island, right? So about a year ago, there were almost 1,000 people at Dealey Plaza in Dallas because they expected John F. Kennedy Jr. to come back from the dead and to run for vice president with Donald Trump, right? Now, I think that's probably not going to happen. But my point is, how did they find each other, right? You know, I mean, there have always been people who believe things like that, but this is how it changes. But I think at the end of the day, look, I don't ultimately know. What I do know is, I don't ultimately know the answer to your question in a definitive way, but what I do know is that many of the strategies we're adopting aren't working. Right? A lot of people who adhere to these theories, they're not dumb people. And it's not helpful for the mass media to keep saying that they are. I was on this panel recently with, there were 7 or 8 of us on this panel, and all of the others worked for a great metropolitan newspaper situated on the East Coast, right? And they were talking about how they feel like they can't really do their jobs anymore as journalists because there's a whole bunch of people in the country who don't believe in facts, right? Well, I mean, the thing is, I mean, I was a little bit of the skunk at the garden party that day because I said to them, look, that's not true. These people believe in facts. I mean, they have to be able to operate a car. I mean, they wouldn't get out of bed in the morning if they didn't believe in facts. They do believe in them. They know there is such a thing as an objective reality. Here's the thing. They don't trust you to tell them what it is. They don't trust you, right? And one of the reasons why they don't trust you is because they think that you think they're stupid. And when you say things like they don't believe in facts, it sounds like you actually think that, right? And so I was thinking to myself, these people aren't badly intentioned, and these folks aren't badly intentioned either. I mean, there's always going to be some extremes who are, but they're not really badly intentioned. But they're talking way past each other because neither group sees the other in a human and personal way. And that don't even recognize the content of their own words in describing these people. And so that is the kind of thing, whatever way forward in overcoming these conspiracy theories and all the rest, it has to avoid that at a minimum, because that's not working. It's just making the problem worse. Yeah.
I've been thinking the biggest fear, like especially the U.S., where you have this change demographically occurring so fast. The main topics is always like, we want America back, or we want to look like the way it was. And I think the biggest fear is all these changes of Asian, Hispanic,
Right.
how drastically it's changing. That the America that has been for the last 200 years is not going to be any longer.
Right.
And, still the people in power, the white people, so, they're like, you want to hold on to a country as long as possible, because you don't know what's going to happen when these people take over.
Right.
And I think that's might be.
I think that's definitely one of the fears. Yes, I think that that's certainly true. I think it would be helpful to try to, for us to try to recover a national narrative that we could all at some level share in. I mean, at the end of the day, like, what's happening in this country with its demographic changes is something that's happened throughout American history, right? It's been we've been transformed by changing demographics, as a result of migration and immigration and all the rest. And I think that I think the problem is that when we are cut off from a shared sense of history, right, from a shared narrative, then we become untethered, and then we use whatever narrative we have to sort of, to beat back this force or to drag that force forward, and that's bad, because without a shared sense of history, a people become rudderless, because there's history is the soul of conscience, and yeah. Yes.
You talked about the polarization in the Catholic Church itself, particularly in this country. Do you see a way that is perpetuated through the way we sort ourselves into different parishes and different organizations? And if you think that's contributing, how do you think we could solve some of these issues?
Well, I think that there is I think the most profound challenge that faces the church in America is ecclesiological, which is the theological term for how do you understand church? What does it mean to say that this is a church and we are church? A lot of people would say that it's something else, but I think that the most profound question facing the American church is, what do we mean when we say the church? right? And so I think one of the ways that we can overcome the polarization within the church is by being very, very clear in our minds what we mean by it. And there are some things that I think we mean when we say the church that it's not good that it means only that, right? So for example, some people will say, well, you know, the church won't allow this or that, and what they really mean are bishops, right? Some people are thinking, when they say the church, they're thinking the bishops. And what's interesting to me is that is the most outrageous form of clericalism, right? Because what you're saying is, I'm going to filter my entire experience of being Catholic through the actions of the bishops, through like the biggest priests there are, right? The biggest clerics there are. So what do we mean, right? I mean, on the border with Mexico, in every county on the southern border of the United States of America, there was a work of the church serving people, right? That's the church too, right? You're the church, right? And I think that's profoundly important. Other times, people will mean that when they say the church, they mean everybody but the bishops, right? As if you know, when we say the people of God, you know, people sometimes think that means we the people, right? But it doesn't actually mean that, right? Because the people of God includes everybody from the Pope on down, right? And yet sometimes it's used in this kind of like vaguely Marxist way, right? of talking about the people, right? And then the other thing that happens though is that if we don't have a robust understanding of church, then what we wind up with, and this is also the principal liability of clericalism, is what we wind up with is an impoverished imagination, right? And we mistake the church that we know in its cultural manifestation in this time and place for the church. I'll give you an example. When I went to, when I was in Guyana, South America, I went there as a novice. It's an interesting place. In the interior of Guyana, where there are a number of Amerindian villages, the Jesuits, no missionary had reached the interior of Guyana until 1919. The Jesuits arrived there in 1920. And when they arrived, they were, the Amerindians were nomadic and polygamous and all the rest. And I'm not necessarily making value statements about that, but I'm just saying they weren't Christian, right? And the Jesuits evangelized them, and they became Christians, and they learned crop rotation, and then the Jesuits did this clever thing. They didn't outlaw polygamy. They just said, we're going to educate the boys and the girls too. Then within a generation, the girls were like, we're not doing this polygamy thing anymore. Right? And so, but here's the thing. So that church, the church in Guyana, is 100 years old. It just had its 100th anniversary, right? And they see their priest every month. He comes out, he says Mass, he hears confessions, he leaves behind the Eucharist. The rest of the month, they have communion services, the lay people preach, they sometimes catechize, they bury the dead, they sometimes witness marriages, and so forth, right? That is their only conception of the Catholic Church. They know no other way of being Catholic. But when I was there, I had just come from Boston, right? And they had just put out a study the year before I entered the Jesuits, the Archdiocese of Boston, that said, if you are standing at Boston City Hall at noon on a weekday, in any month of the year, then you have about a half a dozen choices of a noon Mass within an eighth of a mile, right? Well, what does that tell you, right? And now we're having a vocation crisis because we can't have all of those Masses, right? But what it tells you is that there's a different imagination at work here, right? I mean, because those Guyanese are every bit as Catholic as we are, So it's how you understand church will influence how you can imagine the church of tomorrow and make sure that it remains continuous with the church of yesterday and today too. Yes?
I'm struck or stuck on your two comments about the U.S. for one is many and Catholic one. Many is one and one is many.
Right.
So when I think of myself as a Catholic in the U.S., are those just facts or do they complement each other, challenge each other? Is there an intersection? Is that a place for discourse?
Yeah. Wow, I'm teaching a whole course about this. That's the very question we're examining in my course, is what are they compatible? And or complementary, and then there are ways in which they are, and then ways in which they're not, right? I mean, if you are one holy, Catholic, and apostolic, right? One holy, Catholic, and apostolic. These are the words we say every Sunday, right? One holy, Catholic, and apostolic. Well, that's going to be different. It's going to be in some kind of tension with, national, with because one is transnational, right? It's going to be, by definition, a country with borders and a discrete political system is not Catholic in the sense of being universal, right? If it's apostolic, meaning that our own leadership, our own communities are rooted in the leadership of people who are successors to the apostles across a 2,000-year history, then our personal allegiance is not 100% to our country, right? It belongs to another historical and transnational reality, and so forth. So there are ways in which they're in tension, and it has been, throughout the history of the church in this country, people have answered it differently. So in other words, when the haters went against Al Smith and John Kennedy, when they were Catholics nominated for president, when the haters went against them, right, they said, well, these Catholics, they had this special allegiance to the Pope, and the Pope is the head of a foreign country. Well, they weren't exactly wrong about that, right? but we were pretty certain that we could do both, right? And so there is always going to be a tension. I mean, there's a way in which Catholicism is at home and not in the United States. That'll always be the case. And you can see it in the debates that we have within the church every 4 years, right? Around, can you vote for this person? Should I vote for that person? Am I a good Catholic if I think this or that, so forth? Methodists don't have these disputes, right? They really don't, right? I mean, they're not worried about things like that. And, when a Methodist goes to be confirmed by the U.S. Senate, nobody on the Judiciary Committee asks the Methodist, well, the Methodist Church is opposed to the death penalty. Can you actually be, right, impartial on that question? The Catholics get asked that. And even more, Catholics ask themselves that. So, yeah, it's a tension.
Yeah, I wanted to bring up, I actually ended up here in 1999 because the two previous Catholic churches that I belonged to, during elections, the priest told you how to vote. And I just found that so offensive. And so can you make a comment about that?
Yeah. That's wrong. If he told you how to vote, that's wrong. And it's wrong according to the bishop's own directives, and it's wrong according to the teaching of the Second Vatican Council, and it's wrong according to the Pope who occupies the See of Peter right now, who says that is to offend your conscience in that way, is a radical misuse of clerical power. There's no way around that one. Yes.
You talked about how you change conversation with someone that's attacking a group of people saying the liberals are doing this and the conservatives are doing this, and then you uncomfortably stop them by saying, you're talking about someone I love.
Right.
What happens next?
Yeah.
How do you
Right.
take that to something productive instead of just like making everyone feel?
Well, they'll say, "Oh, well, I didn't mean that." I said, "Well, I know you didn't." I said, and I don't mean to put you on the spot here, but what I'm saying is that when we're talking about anyone, we're talking about people that people love, right? And that because we've depersonalized our politics so much, we're doing real violence to each other, and it's not about our differences of opinions. It's about our manifest lack of charity, right? So and then they'll say something, "Oh, tell me more about that," or "You're crazy," right? Or it's, "Oh, well, it's just, of course you're a priest, you have to say this," right? But I believe it. I mean, I don't think priests have to say it, because not many do. So, but no, I think what that statement does is it opens up a little space, and you hope that the person is, willing to be open. I mean, I think it's very important to remember, and this speaks to both and we might be out of time, right? Or coming up on it?
12 after.
What's that?
12 after 8
Oh,
right now.
oh, right, so we are. But, well, this might not be a bad way to close. I mean, at the end of the day, do you all remember when John Paul II, no, was it? Who was it? John Paul II and John the 23rd were canonized on the same day. Do you remember that? And people were like, "Oh, this is Pope Francis doing this brilliant political tactic, right? Bringing together these two different people, right? The guy who called the Second Vatican Council, and then the other guy who kind of pushed it back a bit." And so I got these calls from the secular press, because that was part of my job at America. And they said, "Well, would you call this father like a bipartisan canonization?" And I was like, no, absolutely no. It's not. It's wrong completely. I mean, even as an analogy, it's wrong. I said, here's the thing: they are being canonized on the same day because the church recognizes their holiness, right? And in that sense, there's no difference between them. And they said, "Well, I can't really write that." Now I understand that, because it's not a reporter's job to describe the mystery of the church in a news brief, but it's really important that we remember that, because what Pope Francis reminded us of on that day was that the object of Christian discipleship is not to be right, it's to be holy, right? And the reason why that's so important in terms of what we're talking about is if we aspire to holiness, right? If we are praying on a daily basis that the one who is truth and the way and the life will possess our hearts, then this will give us the freedom to do what we need to do in our relationships to overcome polarization both within and without. And that's because the price of being wrong has already ultimately been paid by the Lord himself, right? It lowers the stakes for us. What it means is if you're really going to enter into a dialogue, you're really going to have a genuine debate and argument, whether it's in the church or outside, which is the thing we all say we want, civil, smart, intelligent argument, then we have to have the freedom to be wrong. You have to have the freedom to be changed by the encounter with another. And the way we, as Christians, do that is by remembering that our holiness is a gift that comes from the slow work of God's grace within us. It doesn't come from having the right opinion. Okay. Because as my father used to say, opinions are like butts. Everybody has one, and they usually are no good. Thank you very much.
On behalf of all of us, thank you, Matt, so much.
Oh, it's my
5
pleasure.
degrees are paying off. Today is a feast of Our Lady of Montserrat, a special place in the Jesuit history, the books.
Yeah.
That's where Ignatius of Loyola left behind his sword once and for all. So, through Our Lady of Montserrat, God bless you.
Amen. Pray for us. Thank you.